your phone lights up. A name you haven't seen in weeks, maybe months. For a second, your heart pauses, not because you miss them, but because you remember who you were when they left. The unanswered questions, the quiet nights, the strength you built in the silence. And now, after all that distance, they reach out like nothing ever happened. No explanation, no apology, just a message. This is the moment that defines you. Not their words, but your response. Because when someone comes back after silence, they're not just testing connection. They're testing access. They're testing whether the distance changed you, or if you're still waiting where they left you. What you do next can either reopen old wounds or confirm your growth. This isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anything. It's about power, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing your worth, protecting your peace, and choosing yourself without saying too much. Silence changes power dynamics because it removes emotional access, and emotional access is where control often lives. When communication stops, the person who expected availability suddenly loses certainty. They no longer know your thoughts, your reactions, or your emotional state. That absence creates discomfort, not because of love alone, but because predictability is gone. When someone knows you will respond, explain, reassure, or react, they feel grounded in control. Silence interrupts that pattern and forces awareness. In many connections, especially uneven ones, one person unconsciously holds more power simply by being less emotionally invested. Silence reverses that imbalance. The moment you stop filling the gaps, stop asking questions, stop chasing clarity, the other person is left alone with their own thoughts. They are no longer distracted by your presence. Reflection begins not because they suddenly became self-aware, but because there is nothing else to lean on. Silence also removes the ability to rewrite the narrative. When someone leaves and later returns, they often rely on conversation to soften what happened, to minimize their absence, or to explain it in a way that preserves their self-image. Silence doesn't argue. Silence doesn't challenge. Silence doesn't validate excuses. It simply exists, and that existence forces honesty. Without dialogue, there is no emotional negotiation. The truth sits quietly and waits. Another shift happens internally. Silence gives you space to detach emotionally. Detachment doesn't mean indifference, it means clarity. With distance, you begin to see patterns you couldn't see while you were emotionally involved. You recognize how often you adjusted, how often you waited, how often you explained yourself to someone who wasn't listening. That awareness strengthens your sense of self and weakens emotional dependency. The less dependent you are, the less power anyone has over your reactions. Silence also changes how value is perceived. Constant availability can unintentionally lower perceived value, not because you are worth less, but because your presence becomes expected. When you disappear from someone's emotional landscape, your absence becomes noticeable. They are confronted with what life feels like without your energy, your understanding, your consistency. That realization often arrives late, after silence has already done its work. Power dynamics shift further because silence signals self-respect. It communicates boundaries without confrontation. You are no longer negotiating your worth through words. You are enforcing it through behavior. This can feel unsettling to someone who is comfortable accessing you without accountability. Silence is not punishment, it is protection. And protection always redistributes power. Emotionally immature people struggle most with silence because it denies them feedback. They don't know where they stand. They don't know if they are forgiven, missed, or forgotten. That uncertainty can trigger anxiety, curiosity, or regret, not because they lost you entirely, but because they lost certainty. Certainty is often mistaken for love, but it is actually control over outcome. For you, silence becomes grounding. It teaches patience, emotional regulation, and restraint. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop seeking immediate relief through communication. You learn to sit with discomfort without escaping it through contact. That inner stability is where real power develops. When someone reaches out after silence, they often sense this shift even if they can't articulate it. Your energy feels different because it is different. Silence also filters intention. Someone who reaches out only because they feel lonely, bored, or curious will lose interest when they don't receive immediate emotional engagement. Someone who reaches out with genuine accountability will respect your pace and boundaries. Silence exposes motivation without interrogation. You don't have to ask why they came back. Their response to your silence tells you everything. Ultimately, silence changes power dynamics by removing emotional leverage from the past and placing it firmly in the present. You are no longer reacting to what happened. You are responding from who you have become. And that shift is felt even when nothing is said. When someone reaches out only after distance has been created, it often reveals more about the role silence played than about sudden emotional growth. Distance removes emotional cushioning. While communication is active, even inconsistent attention can create the illusion of connection. Silence strips that illusion away. Without daily messages, reassurance, or emotional availability, a person is forced to confront what they lost access to. Clarity emerges not because they suddenly changed, but because the absence removed distraction. People rarely feel the full weight of someone's presence until it is gone. When you were there, your emotional energy quietly supported the connection. You listened, adjusted, empathized, and often made room for their moods or uncertainty. Once silence begins, that emotional labor disappears. The person left behind experiences a shift in emotional atmosphere. Life feels less buffered. That absence can awaken appreciation, curiosity, or regret, but it is the silence that activates awareness, not intention. Another reason people reach out after distance is the loss of control. When communication stops, they no longer know where they stand with you. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, especially when they once had predictable access. Silence interrupts their ability to monitor your emotional state or their importance in your life. Reaching out becomes a way to reestablish orientation, to see if they still matter, to check whether the door remains open. Silence also allows reality to settle in. While communication is ongoing, emotions stay in motion. There is always another message coming, another chance to smooth things over, another moment to delay accountability. Distance removes that buffer. Without your presence, unresolved feelings surface. Guilt, doubt, and self-reflection become harder to avoid. Reaching out can be an attempt to relieve that internal discomfort rather than an expression of accountability. Loneliness plays a role as well. Silence creates space, and space can feel heavy. When distractions fade, memories surface. They remember your consistency, your understanding, the way you made things feel stable. In moments of emotional quiet, nostalgia can blur reality. The mind often remembers comfort more vividly than conflict. Reaching out becomes a way to reconnect with familiarity, rather than to repair what was broken. There is also the element of comparison. Once you step back, people often begin to notice what you provided when it's no longer there. Other interactions may feel shallow. Other connections may not offer the same emotional safety. Distance allows them to measure what they lost against what they have. That comparison can spark realization, but realization does not always equal readiness. Sometimes reaching out after silence is driven by fear. Fear that they misjudged you. Fear that you moved on. Fear that their absence cost them something meaningful. Silence signals strength, and strength can be intimidating. When someone senses they may no longer have emotional access, they attempt to re-enter before the door closes completely. Silence also exposes intention through timing. If someone reaches out only when you have stopped trying, stopped explaining, stopped chasing, it suggests that your effort, not your presence, was sustaining the connection. Distance reveals whether they valued you as a person or the emotional reassurance you provided. The urge to reconnect often comes when the benefits of your presence are no longer freely available. From your perspective, this clarity is crucial. Distance allows you to observe without emotional urgency. You can recognize whether the message comes with accountability, consistency, and respect, or whether it simply tests availability. Silence gives you the advantage of awareness. You are no longer reacting from longing, but responding from understanding. Ultimately, people reach out after distance because silence removes comfort and forces reflection. It exposes dependency, unsettles familiarity, and invites realization. But realization alone is not transformation. Understanding this allows you to respond with discernment rather than hope, and with self-respect rather than emotional reflex. The difference between responding with strength and reacting emotionally lies in where the response is coming from. Reaction is immediate and driven by unresolved feelings. Strength is deliberate and grounded in clarity. When someone reaches out after silence, the emotional body often responds before the rational mind. Old attachment patterns awaken, memories resurface, and the desire to feel chosen again can rush in. Emotional reaction seeks relief. It wants to ease discomfort, close the gap, or restore familiarity. Strength, on the other hand, is comfortable with pause. Reacting emotionally usually comes from the version of you that was waiting, hoping, or questioning your worth during the silence. That version remembers the uncertainty and wants reassurance that it mattered. This reaction often shows up as over-explaining, responding too quickly, or reopening conversations that were never resolved. It may feel honest in the moment, but it places emotional power back in the hands of someone who already demonstrated inconsistency. Responding with strength requires emotional regulation. It means allowing the initial wave of feelings to pass without acting on them. Strength does not deny emotion. It acknowledges it without letting it lead. This pause is critical. It gives you time to assess why the message affects you and what you actually want now, not what you wanted when the silence began. The ability to wait before responding is itself a sign of inner stability. Another key difference is intention. Emotional reaction seeks validation. It hopes the other person's message means something has changed. Strength seeks alignment. It asks whether the interaction supports your well-being, your boundaries, and the person you have become. A strong response does not assume meaning where there is none. It observes patterns rather than promises. Reacting emotionally often brings the past into the present. You may reference what happened, how you felt, or why their silence hurt. While these feelings are valid, expressing them impulsively can reopen wounds without resolution. Strength understands that clarity does not always come from explanation. Sometimes it comes from restraint. You do not need to educate someone on the impact of their absence if they did not care enough to prevent it. Tone also changes when responding from strength. Emotional reactions tend to be charged defensive or overly accommodating. They carry urgency. Strength sounds calm. It is measured and neutral. Not cold, not distant, but steady. This tone communicates self-respect more clearly than emotional intensity ever could. It shows that you are no longer governed by the need to be understood at all costs. Responding with strength also means accepting that you may not get the outcome you once wanted. Emotional reaction clings to hope. It imagines reconciliation, apology, or closure. Strength accepts uncertainty. It is not afraid of losing the connection because it is no longer losing itself in the process. This acceptance reduces anxiety and restores emotional balance. There is also a difference in boundaries. Emotional reaction often ignores them. It prioritizes connection over self-protection. Strength honors boundaries even when feelings are present. It understands that not every message deserves access, and not every attempt at contact deserves engagement. Choosing whether to respond at all is part of responding with strength. Perhaps the most important difference is how you feel afterward. Emotional reactions often leave you feeling exposed, unsettled, or regretful. You may replay the conversation, wonder if you said too much, or feel emotionally drained. Responses rooted in strength leave you feeling grounded. Even if the outcome is uncertain, your inner state remains intact. You did not abandon yourself to be seen. Strength is not about withholding emotion as punishment. It is about responding from wholeness rather than need. When you respond from strength, you are no longer asking the other person to complete something inside you. You are simply deciding whether their presence fits into the life and peace you have built. And that shift changes everything. Self-respect is the compass that guides every response when someone reaches out after silence. It is the understanding that your time, energy, and emotional space are valuable and cannot be treated carelessly. When someone disappears, the emotional gap they leave behind often triggers old patterns of seeking approval or validation. Self-respect interrupts that instinct. It reminds you that your worth is inherent, not contingent on whether someone notices it or regrets neglecting it. This awareness transforms how you engage with the person reaching out. Responding from self-respect requires evaluating the purpose behind the message, not just the words themselves. Many times, people reach out because they feel inconvenience, boredom, or fleeting regret. Their motivations are often self-centered. Self-respect teaches you to prioritize your well-being over their emotional convenience. It encourages patience, observation, and discernment before offering access to your attention or energy. In doing so, you protect yourself from repeating cycles that once left you vulnerable or unsettled. Self-respect also shifts the focus from reaction to reflection. It helps you recognize patterns in past interactions that may have caused emotional strain, manipulation, or imbalance. You begin to understand that responding immediately or emotionally might restore connection, but it may also reopen wounds. Boundaries are the physical and emotional expression of self-respect. By upholding them, you communicate that you value yourself and will not tolerate behavior that compromises your integrity. Silence, in this sense, is a tool to maintain dignity rather than a weapon to punish. Moreover, self-respect allows you to measure your response against your own standards rather than external expectations. You no longer feel pressured to meet someone else's emotional needs simply because they are reaching out. Your response becomes intentional, guided by a desire to honor your own growth. This often means responding calmly, briefly, or even choosing not to respond at all. Each option becomes a reflection of your inner strength, signaling that your peace is not negotiable. When self-respect guides a response, emotional manipulation loses its power. People who attempt to induce guilt, evoke nostalgia, or stir unresolved feelings cannot control you if you have clear boundaries and a strong sense of self. You no longer engage out of fear of loss or longing for validation. Instead, you engage on terms that safeguard your well-being. The clarity that comes from self-respect ensures that any interaction is meaningful and does not compromise your emotional stability. Self-respect also fosters confidence in silence. Choosing not to respond immediately or at all is not avoidance, it is deliberate preservation of your dignity. By refusing to rush into engagement, you demonstrate that your energy is not freely available to be tested. This calm, unreactive stance often communicates more powerfully than words could. It signals that you are in control of your boundaries and will not compromise them for temporary comfort or closure. Finally, self-respect nurtures long-term emotional health. By responding through the lens of self-worth, you reinforce your own stability and resilience. You do not allow external actions to dictate your emotional state. You learn to navigate the complex space between curiosity and composure, between empathy and preservation. Each choice guided by self-respect strengthens your identity, ensuring that any interaction, whether reconciliatory, neutral, or final, aligns with your personal values. Through self-respect, the act of responding becomes a reflection of who you are now, not who you were when the silence began. It allows you to reclaim your power, prioritize your peace, and engage on terms that honor your growth, ensuring that your response is never a concession, but a conscious decision rooted in dignity and strength. When someone reaches out after a prolonged period of silence, one of the most important principles to understand is that sometimes silence deserves silence in return. This idea is not rooted in revenge or bitterness. It is rooted in respect for yourself, your emotional boundaries, and the lessons that the period of silence has taught you. Silence is a teacher, and it carries with it the weight of reflection, growth, and clarity. When someone disappears or neglects your emotional presence, their absence creates a space where you learn to value your own time, your emotional energy, and your inner peace. Responding immediately or impulsively risks undoing the insights gained during this period. Silence in return becomes a tool of self-preservation, a way of honoring the distance that helped you regain perspective and strength. When you return silence to someone who once took it for granted, you are asserting that your presence is not a commodity to be accessed at whim. Emotional energy is a resource, and once it has been depleted or disregarded, it should not be casually reoffered. Silence in return signals that your time and attention are not freely available for testing. It communicates that emotional respect must be earned, not assumed. This is particularly important when the person reaching out has a history of inconsistency or absence. If their silence caused pain or uncertainty, your silence mirrors the lesson they were meant to understand, not as punishment, but as a reinforcement of boundaries. Silence in return also allows clarity to emerge. When someone has been absent, their motivations for reappearing are often mixed curiosity, regret, loneliness, or even selfish convenience. If you respond immediately, it can blur your understanding of their true intentions. By remaining silent, you create a pause that forces both yourself and the other person to confront the reality of the situation. You allow time to reflect on whether their outreach aligns with accountability, respect, and genuine understanding. Silence becomes a filter, separating those who are reaching out for the right reasons from those who are simply seeking temporary comfort. Additionally, silence preserves emotional equilibrium. Responding impulsively often triggers old patterns of attachment, hope, or anxiety. These patterns can cloud judgment and lead to interactions that compromise the emotional growth you achieved during the period of silence. When you respond with silence instead of words, you maintain control over your emotional state. You no longer allow past habits, guilt, or longing to dictate your behavior. The act of withholding a response demonstrates maturity. It shows that your engagement is deliberate, not reactive, and that your peace is more important than satisfying someone else's temporary curiosity. Silence in return also communicates strength without confrontation. Words can be manipulated, misinterpreted, or used to reopen old wounds. Silence, however, is unambiguous. It conveys that you are not accessible in the way you once were, and that emotional boundaries have been redefined. This form of communication is subtle, yet powerful. It speaks volumes without saying a single word. The person reaching out is forced to confront the consequences of their absence, and the emotional impact often resonates more deeply than any explanation could provide. Moreover, silence allows you to maintain perspective. It prevents the temptation to overanalyze or overexplain, which often happens when emotions run high. By choosing silence, you detach from the immediate pressure to respond, allowing rational assessment of the situation. You can evaluate whether the engagement aligns with your values, growth, and well-being, rather than reacting to fleeting emotional impulses. This distance ensures that any eventual response, if it occurs, is intentional and grounded in clarity rather than nostalgia or attachment. Finally, silence in return is a form of self-respect that reinforces independence. It demonstrates that your emotional state does not depend on the attention or validation of someone who was previously absent. You no longer operate from a place of need or compulsion. Instead, you operate from a place of choice, control, and sovereignty. This autonomy is empowering. It signals to both yourself and others that your presence is deliberate, your energy is valuable, and your peace is non-negotiable. In essence, when silence deserves silence in return, it is a practice of wisdom, patience, and emotional integrity. It honors the lessons of absence, reinforces boundaries, preserves inner peace, and communicates strength without confrontation. It is a deliberate, conscious choice that prioritizes long-term well-being over momentary impulse. And it serves as a reminder that your presence and emotional energy are yours to govern, not to be casually tested or taken for granted. Choosing peace over reopening old wounds is a deliberate act of self-preservation that requires awareness, patience, and emotional maturity. When someone reaches out after a prolonged silence, it often triggers memories and feelings that have been carefully managed or suppressed. The instinct to respond can feel urgent because it awakens old attachments, nostalgia, or the desire to explain yourself. However, reacting impulsively can undo the progress you've made in healing, clarity, and self-respect. Choosing peace means recognizing that your emotional stability and inner calm are more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of addressing someone else's curiosity or regret. Old wounds carry energy, and reopening them often benefits the person who caused them more than it benefits you. When you engage in a conversation to clarify, justify, or revisit the past, you may inadvertently validate behaviors that once hurt you. This is particularly true when the person reaching out is attempting to alleviate their own guilt, regain comfort, or regain access to your energy. Peace, in contrast, is maintained when you refuse to engage in patterns that previously destabilized your emotional well-being. Choosing not to reopen old wounds is a way of enforcing boundaries and reinforcing the lesson that your emotional space is sacred. Choosing peace requires discernment about the true motivation behind the outreach. Many people who reappear after silence are not seeking reconciliation or genuine accountability. They may be curious, lonely, or uncertain, but these motivations are not inherently respectful of your emotional journey. When you respond without considering your own needs and boundaries, you risk entering a dynamic that prioritizes their temporary comfort over your long-term growth. By choosing peace, you consciously prioritize yourself and your healing over their curiosity or convenience. This practice also involves managing expectations. Reaching out after silence rarely guarantees understanding, apology, or change. Responding with the hope of these outcomes often leads to frustration, disappointment, or renewed emotional turbulence. Choosing peace acknowledges that closure, validation, and accountability may not be provided by the person who caused harm. True closure comes from within. By maintaining your calm, you create internal closure without needing external affirmation. Silence, in this context, is a tool to preserve your equilibrium rather than a passive act of avoidance. Choosing peace also requires embracing acceptance. Acceptance does not mean condoning what happened or forgetting the pain. It means recognizing that the past cannot be changed and that the emotional labor of revisiting it may harm more than heal. This perspective allows you to respond, if at all, in a way that is measured, brief, and grounded, rather than reactive. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. Silence, in this sense, is an affirmation of your boundaries and a demonstration of self-respect. Furthermore, choosing peace fosters emotional independence. When you stop reacting to attempts at re-engagement, you signal that your emotional state is self-determined. You are not dependent on someone else's recognition, apology, or explanation to maintain your stability. This independence reinforces personal growth and prevents regressions into old attachment patterns. Over time, it strengthens your capacity to navigate future interactions with clarity, confidence, and composure. Finally, choosing peace cultivates long-term resilience. Life often presents situations where others' actions challenge your sense of security, trust, or self-worth. By consciously maintaining peace instead of reopening old wounds, you practice discipline and emotional intelligence. You create a consistent inner environment where your sense of value and calm is not contingent on external actions. Each decision to prioritize peace reinforces your emotional sovereignty, allowing you to move forward without being tethered to the instability of past dynamics. Ultimately, choosing peace over reopening old wounds is an exercise in self-sovereignty. It is the conscious decision to protect your emotional energy, honor your boundaries, and uphold the growth you have achieved. In doing so, you demonstrate that your healing and inner calm are non-negotiable, that your response is rooted in strength rather than reaction, and that your life is guided by principles of dignity, self-respect, and emotional wisdom. In conclusion, knowing how to respond when he reaches out after silence is less about what you say and more about who you have become. Silence has reshaped the dynamics, clarified intentions, and revealed truths that words alone could not. Your growth, self-respect, and emotional clarity are the guides that determine whether you respond, how you respond, or whether you allow silence to continue. Responding with strength, prioritizing your peace, and honoring the boundaries you have established demonstrates not only self-awareness, but also a quiet power that cannot be manipulated. The real transformation is internal, understanding your worth, recognizing patterns, and choosing actions that serve your long-term emotional well-being. Whether you reply or remain silent, the choice is yours, and it should always reflect the version of you who survived, learned, and now moves forward with dignity, calm, and unwavering self-respect.